the copy takers were all women and the copy runners were all women, but the journalists who were doing the stories, who were going out and reporting on the games, were all men. The sports editor was my neighbour. I don't think we're moving into a world that is all flowers and roses for girls, women in this industry, but I think it's certainly different.
I don't want no disrespect. No text on a check.
Welcome back to episode 5 of Breaking Barriers, and this week we've got Julie Kissick on with us.
For those who don't know who you are, Julie, can you just give us a brief overview of your career so far?
Yeah, sure. So I currently run the sports journalism degree at the University of South Wales. And prior to that, I was acting editor at BBC Radio Wales. I was also deputy editor at BBC Radio Wales, and I've had quite a long career in broadcasting and journalism.
Do you think you could kind of let us know a bit more about the struggles you've had to face? And I know that Chris and I beforehand we were talking about being a woman in sports journalism in the 90s and how I think it was even like you couldn't even get a big role just by being a woman. I mean, you must have faced some struggles in that time.
Yes, and I think women generally still, certainly in sports journalism, in sports broadcasting, still face quite a lot of struggles. I think the thing that is probably the glue that unites us all is this sort of sense of determination and not being willing to accept no for an answer. And that's the same for an awful lot of people in an awful lot of industries, isn't it? It's very easy for people on the outside to say, oh well, you just got to you've got to apply, and it's all very straightforward. It generally isn't like that. And I think as a woman, certainly for me, I mean, I started my career, I suppose, at 14. So I was a tea girl. My first role in journalism was making the tea for the reporters on a newspaper called The Sporting, which was based in Swansea. And I sort of worked my way up from being tea girl to being a copy taker. So back in the day before the internet, which I know would be very difficult for you to get your head around, journalists who were working as reporters at various different games, matches on a Saturday afternoon, so they would go out, they would leave the office, they would go out armed with a notepad. No such things as mobile phones in those days, and they used to have to phone their stories through. So I'm talking about a physical phone, I'm not talking about a mobile phone, something that was plugged into a point somewhere. And they would phone their copy through, their stories through, and the copy takers would take their copy down, and copy runners, so I progressed from being a tea girl to a copy runner, would literally take the paper from the person who had typed it, not on a laptop or on a keyboard, but on a typewriter, and physically run it into the next room where the sub-editors were. And in those days, the sub-editors then would be responsible for making sure that those stories were edited and got into the newspapers. And the copy takers were all women and the copy runners were all women, but the journalists who were doing the stories, who were going out and reporting on the games, were all men. So my sort of first exposure, I suppose, to those sorts of barriers that as a woman I've faced throughout my career in one shape or form happened to me very early on. I was exposed to it very early on. And what's quite interesting about my story is that the sports editor was my neighbour. So the sports editor had known me since I was a little girl. He lived opposite my parents before I was born, and the first sort of knockback, I suppose, I got was when I was 18 and I'd just done my A-levels and I was about to go to university to study English, and I wanted to have a Saturday job working on the sporting newspaper. And the only jobs that were open to me were jobs that the other women did. So being a copy taker, I was too old in that point to be the tea girl, but do you know what I mean? So those sorts of experiences were nothing to do with the fact that I knew people. I had good contacts even when I was quite young, because I'd grown up in the area that I grew up in. Actually, there were 4 journalists living on my estate, so I knew lots of journalists. It wasn't that I didn't know people and I didn't have connections, but actually as a female I wasn't allowed to go for those jobs. And I think it gave me the kind of determination and resilience that effectively has stayed with me probably for the duration of my career, and enabled me to find ways of pushing forward and, as I say, not taking no for an answer, really.
Psychologically, for you, how much of a barrier was that for you, just knowing that because you're a woman, nothing that you can do anything about, you couldn't just get over the line? How did that impact you in the mind?
I think for lots of us, as I say, it made us more determined. It wasn't always possible to navigate those hurdles as effectively as you wanted to, and it did take a lot of perseverance. So the first job that I worked on after I graduated from university, I worked on the newspaper for 5 years, and I was a trainee reporter, so I was an indentured reporter, one of the last, effectively an apprenticeship. So I was one of the last indentured reporters on that newspaper. And for my training as a female, I wasn't allowed to do any training on the sports desk. So all of the men had 3 months on the sports desk. As women, we didn't get offered that. So we spent an additional X number of weeks as sub-editors training or as court reporters training or whatever it might have been. And I think from there, I knew that if I wanted to work in sport in particular, I was going to have to move, because newspapers just didn't have the opportunities that I wanted, certainly not locally. And I ended up going to work for ITV in Wales, and I did get the opportunity then eventually. It did take a lot of perseverance, but I did get the opportunity then to go and work on a programme called Soccer Sunday, which was the football roundup, which was, as you would imagine from the name, was broadcast on a Sunday. And I produced that for a couple of years, and I worked on a rugby programme called The Front Row, and then eventually got an opportunity to go and work for the BBC for the 1999 Rugby World Cup. And then we got into an era where doors were starting to open, and actually it was a bit more, it was certainly more acceptable to be a woman in broadcasting and in journalism, but it was also more in vogue. So there were people who actually thought, editors who thought it was a good thing to have a woman working for them, which again was a bit of a sea change, really.
How does it feel knowing that you just had to spend years and years of fighting and, like you mentioned, determination to go through that experience, and now, because of those struggles and because of everything that you fought for, we've got a generation where, like you mentioned, doors are opening?
I think the important thing that you learn in life is that you can't be what you can't see. So somebody has to go out there and be the trailblazer, I suppose. And although I don't suppose any of us really thought of our situations as ending up with the kinds of outcomes that we've got, I think for a lot of us, it was a case of saying, well, I'm just going to keep at it, and I'm just going to not accept no, and I am going to hopefully make it slightly easier for the next generation that's coming through. And I think that's a good thing. I think the generation of sports journalists in particular that are coming through now will have different issues that they will be facing that we didn't. So the role of social media is also really important and is very it can have hugely negative consequences for young women in this day and age, because it's much easier to criticise people now than it was years ago. I don't think we're moving into a world that is all flowers and roses for girls, women in this industry, but I think it's certainly different. And I think it's important to be able to be role models, to be able to say, look, we did it, and we need you to keep on doing it, really.
Yeah, definitely. So moving forward, you obviously helped set up this course at USW, which I'll be doing the next 3 years. What motivated you to do that, and what will the future hold for students of that course?
I think what motivated me to do it was, again, somebody telling me that I couldn't do it. So it was a suggestion that I had when I was not working full-time at the university, but actually was still working for the BBC. And I had various different conversations with people about sports journalism. I think 5 or 6 years ago, there were probably only a dozen sports journalism courses. So it seemed like the obvious thing to do, but I'd made this proposal quite a long time before that, when there were even fewer sports journalism courses. But at the time, there wasn't an appetite for it. And it was something that I felt really strongly about. And I felt as a woman very strongly about, because I felt that it was something that would be a legacy for me to set up a course like this and to write it, and to be responsible for it in the early stages. And I think my hope was that I think I'm still the only female course leader of however many sports journalism courses there are now. I think there's probably about 20 now, but I don't think there's another woman running the course. And I think for me that was also important, and it was also, again, going back to you can't be what you can't see. I was hopeful that it would encourage female prospective sports journalists to want to come and do a course like this. I do think that there is still a perception amongst females that they are perhaps less likely to succeed on a course that is specifically sport. So I also work across the journalism degree as well, and you'll often meet, I supervise dissertations, and I'll often meet third year students, girls who say to me, I'd love to have done your course, or I'd love to have done a sports journalism course, but I decided at 18, 19 that my best option would be to do a more generic journalism course. And then if I still feel in 3 years' time that I want to go on and do sports journalism, then I will specialise later on. And I think that's a mindset that we still need to do quite a lot of work on.
How do you feel universities can change that? Because, as you mentioned, it seems like there's a lot of work still yet to do, aside from those running the courses, but also what we're teaching young children and teenagers growing up about what they're capable of, especially women and girls.
Yeah, I do think the fact that more female sport is much more accessible these days, particularly women's football, I think that will have a huge impact. I think it's the same with everything, isn't it? These things always take time, and as much as we would like those transitions to be very smooth and very swift, they're often not. It's about doing that legwork. And I think the fact that, again, when I was in school, I wasn't allowed to play football. It would be absolutely unheard of for girls to play football. That's not the case these days, thankfully. So I think that the changes will happen, and some of them will just happen organically. Some of them will mean that more girls are playing sport, maybe feel that they're not going to get to any kind of elite level as players, but are still really interested in the stories of sport, still interested in writing, still interested in broadcasting, and therefore those changes will happen. And it is a case of keeping plugging away, really.
And finally, just for yourself, what does the future hold for you? Is there any sort of ambitions that you'd like to achieve in the rest of your career?
Oh, that makes me sound dreadfully old, Chris. I've still got donkey's years left to work. There's lots of things that I want to do, yes. I think that, and you know, a lot of them definitely involve helping to empower women to go on and do whatever it is they want to do, whether that's in sport, in sports journalism, in broadcasting. I think there's a lot of research that still needs to go on around how we change those perceptions, and I think that's something that I'm really keen to get involved in, certainly now that the sports journalism course has run its full course. So we've had our first, unfortunately they didn't get a graduation ceremony, but we have had our first graduates this year because the course has been running for 3 years. So I think for me, I'd really like to be a part of that, and I'm really passionate about telling people stories. I think that the way that we learn from one another is often being able to understand how other people have processed things and how they've overcome those things, and that kind of thing is something that I'm really keen to get involved in. I've also got a podcast bubbling away, so that's going to be launched fairly soon, and I like travelling, although my plans to go to Australia this summer were thwarted along with everybody else's, unfortunately, and I'm quite keen actually to work in Australia if I can possibly manage it, if we ever get to fly that far again.
Anything else from you, Maryam?
No, I think that's pretty much it. I'm just glad to kind of had your insight. I think as a woman of sport who's literally gone through so much and had to fight for so much, it's just inspirational really hearing about, like you mentioned yourself, you're a trailblazer of the sport.
Exactly. And yeah, it's massively appreciate Julie for joining us, and I'll see you in a couple of weeks. And for you lot watching at home, make sure you hit that subscribe button, and if you don't, then you're just lazy, you know, it's for free. But anyway,
You must miss out on Julie.
Exactly. Thank you very much for watching, everyone, and we will see you next time.